Welcome. We are looking at more ACT prep material. We are now moving into chapter 22, which picks up on page 563, and today we're going to go until we get to page 577. So our chapter objectives, once you're on page 563, are to be able to recognize the scientific method, know how it goes in a sequence and how it's used, be able to interpret information from experiments. Some may be related, some may be differing. Be able to evaluate and interpret design, looking for error. Is there any procedural errors in experiments? And then lastly, be able to predict how information affects experimental designs or results. We have a smart points value of 9 for this information, meaning that of the 36 points that you'll receive for the ACT Science, 9 of them will be tied to questions like we're going to be looking through as we move forward. So let's proceed on to page 565. Research summaries are going to be introductory paragraphs that you read, and it's going to provide you with some background information. The background information will be tied to details on an experimental setup. Examples, you'll see things like study 1, experiment 2. You're going to be using these passages to answer questions about the results of the experiments. Sometimes these results will ask you to look at different steps of the scientific method or the experimental design. So in order to get those questions correct, we need to know the steps of the scientific method and what they are, as well as the experimental design. The questions that you will encounter will follow some of these things that they're looking for. Are they appropriately using tools and procedures, and how? Make sure that we understand how the experimental design looks and what the variables are and what the controls are. Looking at experimental designs and results and looking for any kind of flaw. Being able to use experiments to predict outcomes of other things. So in essence, taking what we know and applying it elsewhere. And lastly, being able to identify the impact if something were to be changed in the design. The suggested method for research summaries is very, very similar to what you have already been doing. And that's kind of a smart thing to do, is approach each passage in the exact same way. That way your brain is only thinking about things from one strategic standpoint. And that would be step 1, read the passage. Once again, underlining purpose, hypotheses, looking for key components of the experiment. And when you see 2 different experiments, how are they similar, how are they different? And then secondly, looking at the figures provided, data tables, graphs. We saw previously that it's quite important to look at what the value of the X and Y is and how things are being measured, as well as any trends or relationships you might see. Also, finding support for your answer in the passage. Once again, use your predictions. You're creating predictions here, and then you would match that prediction to the correct answer. So ultimately, nothing new here. It's kind of keeping things consistent. Once again, if things are consistent, it does make it easier for our brain to process these types of questions. Here we're elaborating a little bit more on the reading the passage. Once again, there's not a whole lot new. Locate and underline the purpose. Looking for what the researchers are investigating. You want to know the what. This will be indicated in reading by using the word to. A couple examples: to determine, to evaluate, to examine. So if you see those phrases, you know they're actually telling you what the researchers are investigating. We were doing this to determine that. Make sure that you identify the key components of the experiments. What are the independent variables? What are the dependent variables? And what are the controls? Once again, Independent variables are things that are kept consistent across the board, and dependent variables, that is the information that's actually collected from them. Controls, these are things that are used to show that an independent variable actually does make a difference. So we'll see some examples of that moving forward. Many questions will have you look at two different experimental designs or procedures, and you'll be asked to look for how are they similar, how are they different in regards to their methods. As you go through this information, once again, do not try to understand every little detail. They put a lot more in than you really need to know. Once again, they're creating distractors. They want to see if you can sift through the things that matter and don't matter. So, in order to avoid the distractors, make sure that we locate the results. You'll see those in tables, charts, graphs. Sometimes they'll actually be just explained to you in the words though. Make sure you examine the figures. You would want to do these before you look at the questions. So look at the variables in the figures. Sometimes you'll just have one independent variable and one dependent variable, which would be very, very nice, but I would not expect that to be the case. I would expect you to have more than one independent variable, resulting in more than one dependent variable. Sometimes you'll be looking at which variables change. So you'll need to look at how they're measured. So length, feet, width, time could be seconds, years, months, whatever. So know how things are being measured. Spoke of trends previously, direct or linear trends. Sometimes trends or patterns can be inverse. Finding support in the answer to the passage. Once again, we need to identify questions in the stem of the question and then find these in the passage. Be sure to locate data in the tables and figures that you are given, and use the keywords from the question and stem and finding them in the passage and the information in the tables and figures to predict the correct answer, and then match your predicted answer to the best closest answer from the ABCD options. The scientific method, the steps and process of the process have changed, and depending on what source you look at, they might be slightly different. I know that's been something that's been debated recently in terms of textbooks for biology. But for the purposes of the ACT test, this is the scientific method formula that you need to kind of keep in mind. It's pretty straight generic from any biology book that I've ever used. So step 1, ask a question and make observations. Step 2, formulate a hypothesis. Step 3, test the hypothesis by designing an experiment. Number 4, test the experiment and collect data. 5, analyze the data, make a conclusion. 6, share the results. This page gives you some examples of the observation and research, the hypothesis, the design, so each step of the scientific method. I'm going to trust that you're pretty aware of what each of these items are. However, if you're not, you might want to pause this video and read over some of these in case you're not sure. If you don't know what a control is, for example, this would be a great thing to read over so that you are filled in on what it is. But we are going to move on. As you read through, the ACT, it's not going to tell you exactly, like this is the hypothesis or this is the data they analyzed. You're going to need to kind of identify that, meaning that if you don't know what each component is that was on that previous slide, you do need to know it, which really is going back to what we were talking about previously with basic scientific vocabulary. Like those terms are basic scientific vocabulary. So you will need to be able to find those and locate them as you go through some of the passages and readings. So be prepared for that to kind of be seen. Moving along, we're on page 569 at this point. When you interpret results of experiments, expect to have to go back to where you were looking and noting and circling or underlining the major trends as well as looking at the tables and graphs. I know I spoke previously about circling things that you had noticed in tables and graphs that were mentioned in the questions. That can direct your eyes to where you need to be looking. And when you're asked to locate information in charts and graphs, make sure you ask yourself and know what the figure is actually showing you and what are the units of measurement. Knowing the units of measurement is turning out to be, from what I'm seeing, almost more important than understanding what the graph is actually showing you. In the next video, we're going to be looking at application of the steps and then using that to answer a few questions.